Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lode Holt. As we wrap up walking through the life and ministry of St. Paul together this week, I need to remind you of something that I mentioned on Tuesday. At that point, I mentioned that there had been a severe famine in Judea, and Paul and Barnabas took up a collection to help support the believers in Jerusalem and delivered it there. I called it a pattern that would continue, and indeed it did. On all three of his missionary journeys, Paul took up a collection in the churches he founded and then took that collection back to Jerusalem to help support the believers there. While there wasn't a great persecution during Paul's time, these churches did know scorn from the general society. Well, the church in Jerusalem faced that, plus the scorn and pressure from the Jews who saw this Christian movement as a dangerous sect. Paul knew they needed support, so he connected the churches he founded with the church in Jerusalem, pointing out that that was the mother church and they needed to support and help it. At the end of his third missionary journey, Paul had a couple of aims. One of those was to go to Spain, one of the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire, and tell the news of Jesus there. But before he did that, he needed to take the collection to Jerusalem. When he got there, at first he was warmly received. However, he was warned that he was gaining a reputation for being against the Old Testament laws, and so he was a target for strict Jews. They advised that Paul go through a purification ritual to show that he did follow the guidelines of the Old Testament. The 7-day ritual was almost over when these strict Jews accused him of bringing Gentiles into the temple, and they seized him and drug him out. Roman soldiers heard the ruckus, and to reestablish the peace, they arrested Paul. The soldiers tried to determine what the problem was and tried to flog Paul, but when he told them he was a Roman citizen, they had to refrain. They were going to let Paul go, but he asked to speak to the people first, which caused another riot. The captain of the guard took him to the Sanhedrin to determine what to do with him, and again Paul caused a division and an uproar, so they threw him back into prison. That night 40 men vowed not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. So the tribune set a guard over him and transported him away from Jerusalem to the Roman governor, a man named Felix. Felix was somewhat informed about the Christian movement, and even though a delegation came from Jerusalem to press their case, he declined to hear it until the tribune in charge could come and testify. He had Paul held for 2 years, but gave him a lot of liberty and the freedom to have friends visit and care for his needs. After that time, Felix was replaced by a new governor named Festus. While Festus was in Jerusalem, the Jews there asked for Paul to be returned for trial. Festus saw no guilt in Paul, and Paul appealed to Caesar. It was the right of every Roman citizen to have his or her trial heard by the Caesar. If Paul were about to be let go, why would he appeal to Caesar? Well, many speculate that Paul thought if he had the chance to preach to the Caesar and could convert the Caesar to Christianity, then he could convert the whole empire at once. So Paul was sent off to Rome. On the way, Paul was shipwrecked on the island of Malta, where a venomous snake bit him with no ill effects. This caused quite a stir and led to many believers on the island. Eventually they came to Rome, where Paul was under house arrest for 2 years. It is unknown if Paul actually got to preach to Caesar or not, and most scholars believe he was beheaded sometime between 64 and 69, after the great fire in Rome that Nero blamed on the Christians as a scapegoat. Certainly, Paul was one of the most influential Christians who ever lived. His life and his passion for spreading the news about Jesus is remarkable. And yet, I believe Paul might say that all he did is what each of us should do. Paul knew the surpassing grace of God's love and sought to share the news. How will you go about doing that? Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.